Thank you, Steve. I'm glad all of you made it out this morning after Thanksgiving, and this is probably one of those traveling weekends where people have traveled and then come back sooner or later. Today I want to talk about humility and how we are to learn humility from this section of 1 Peter chapter 5. And when we learn humility, it gives us hope. And that's what our overall theme has been in 1 Peter, is how to live with hope in a hostile world. I can't talk about humility these days without reflecting back on my experience of a year ago in the hospital. Or if you want to go to a place and learn humility, it's at the hospital. That's a good place to do it. And that's where you're totally out of control of your own life. You're dependent on everybody else. And I thought I was going to be dependent on everybody else for a long, long time, since I could hardly move my little finger in the aftermath of my surgery last year. It's really humiliating or humbling. There's a difference between being humbled and being humiliated. The Lord doesn't want us to be humiliated by any means, but He does prescribe a school of humility, of learning to be humble, in His classroom for us as His people. But it was really humbling to have other people on the staff of the hospital come in and bathe me, and to clean up after me in the bathroom and that type of stuff. But I'll probably always remember that. They wouldn't let Marcia do some of that because they wanted to monitor my progress and trying to figure out how to do some of that stuff on my own. I think men struggle with humility probably more than women do. I can't speak from a woman's experience, though, but I can speak from mine as a man. And I think one of the most humbling things that happened to me when I was in St. Luke's Hospital was after Dennis and Marlis had visited me, and they brought lunch in just as they were about to leave. And Marlis said, "Would you like help getting the lid off of that plate?" And of course, I are a man, and I'm not going to have anybody help me in that simple task. And so I politely declined. Do you remember that incident? And for the next 25 minutes, I struggled to get the lid off of that lunch, because Marcia had come home. I think you came to Davenport that day, so I was all there by myself after that, and trying to get the lid off of that plate. You know what I'm talking about, those warming lids that they put on plates? And I couldn't get a grip on it. I couldn't hold it. And I couldn't do a lot of things because I had that neck brace on during that time too. And it was just really humbling because that seems like such a simple task, and yet it was one of the most difficult things I've ever had to do in my whole life. And I think that the Lord used it as a way to another lesson in the school of humility. I must have been struggling with with being humble, or the opposite, pride, for most of my life, because I remember my junior high journalism teacher writing in my yearbook, and this was after a season of awards that we received for our work on the school newspaper, and she wrote in the yearbook for all time, she said, be sure that you accept honors humbly. So that, I can't remember any incident, but she must have noticed something that, might have been my big mouth for all I know. So, we come to this passage, and verse 5, he says, young men in the same way be submissive to those who are older, but all of you clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. So as we start out breaking this passage down, the first thing we learn is that we who are older should lead the way in how to live the Christian life, and those who are younger should follow. Follow the right example, though. The older ones are given the responsibility for the flock and should demonstrate a willingness to watch out for others, as well as being eager to serve and to live as examples for the flock. That's what he said in verse 3. Now Peter turns his attention from the shepherds to the sheep. And so he talks to the younger ones. And just like in marriage, a wife will have no problem submitting to her husband if her husband loves her unconditionally. It just, that's the way it is. It's when the husband turns out to be nasty and mean and a tyrant and a dictator in the home, and substitute any other negative term you can think of, that's when wives struggle with submitting to that type of authority. And in the same way in the church, submissiveness by the younger will be no problem if the elders are carrying out what Peter told them to do in verses 1 to 4. It might be interesting for you to know that men were classified as young if they were under 40 years of age, and old if they were older than 40 years of age. And leadership in the church tended to be confined to the older ones as opposed to the younger ones. Why is he talking like this? And we have to remember that he's trying to prepare his readers for that fiery trial he mentioned in chapter 4, verse 12, to prepare them for that, and how leadership in the church during a fiery trial or any type of difficulty and good followership in the church, both are equally important in times of difficulty and struggle. And remember again that submission means to voluntarily place ourselves in the proper position in the body. Okay, so that just sort of ties things up for the older and the younger. So secondly, all of us must learn humility. It says, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another, because God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. So he's talking now to the congregation as a whole. And we learn submission, it will flow out of a humble heart. But we need to be careful that, it's okay to ask for a humble heart, but never give thanks to God for getting one. You understand the dichotomy in that statement? We should ask God for a humble heart, but don't give thanks to him for getting one. Because as soon as you think you've got one, what happens? Yeah, you're not humble anymore. So some big-time Bible teacher of the past said that, and I thought that was pretty good. So clothe yourselves, and the image is of the slave or the servant in the Roman household. And if they were going to serve, they grabbed an apron, a special apron. Be back in the camera view here. And they put it on, and that meant that they were ready for serving. How do I look? Now, about 3 months ago, I couldn't do what I'm doing right now, which is tying something in the back. So I'm give thanks for that from the Lord. And the word means to bind. I got new pockets now. To bind by means of a cord. And so they would tie an apron, a household servant, and prepare to be serving people. I'm sure that Peter, what do you think Peter has in mind as he writes, take an apron and put it on yourself to be ready to serve? What do you think he has in mind? Something that of his experience with Jesus. When on the night of his betrayal, he took a towel and says, and he girded himself with the towel, and what did he do after he did that? Washed the disciples' feet. And you remember that Peter objected to that. Said, "You're not going to wash my hands and feet." And Jesus said, "Well, if I don't wash your hands and feet, then you have no part in me," because Jesus had a purpose, not only the example of servanthood, but there's an actual spiritual lesson in that procedure of getting clean when the world, you get stained in the world from time to time. And you remember what Jesus said back to him, or what Peter said after Jesus said, "You have no part in me," then if you're going to do that, yeah, give me a whole bath. And Jesus basically, the lesson is you've already had the bath and you only need one. And that's salvation, coming to the Lord the first time in salvation. But after salvation, then we have the need periodically to confess sin and have the blood of Jesus be our continual cleansing agent. So he's already described the elders as those who are eager to serve, and now he uses the image of clothing ourselves, and he says, put on the willingness to serve like an item of clothing. And that is a real strong image in the New Testament of put on the Lord Jesus Christ, or put on, clothe yourselves in humility, as he says here, and Paul writes in Ephesians and Colossians that they should put off the old nature and put on the new nature in Christ. All of that is clothing imagery. And clothing imagery in the Bible goes clear back to God making skin coverings of skins for Adam and Eve after sin, and goes all the way to eternity future in the book of Revelation, where we are clothed in the garments of white garments of righteousness. So clothing is really important. God does care what we wear, by the way, and he wants us to wear the wardrobe of humility, and he will provide learning experiences for that to happen. Now, Peter's already told them in 1 Peter 3, verse 8, to live in harmony with one another, to be sympathetic, to love his brothers, to be compassionate and humble. And Ephesians 4, Paul gets in on it when he says, be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing with one another in love. And then in Colossians chapter 3, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, it's like the outer coat that comes on over the basic clothing. He says, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. So the proud, they will boast in their self-sufficiency and independence, and they feel they have no need for God. And that's one of the problems we have in our culture, is people who think they're A-okay without the Lord. They don't see the need they have of the Lord, so it's hard to introduce them to the solution for the need that they don't think they have. But the humble recognize their total dependency upon God and that they are no better than other people. And what develops mutual submission to others is a basic submission to God himself. Prophet Micah wrote, "He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." And remember Paul's admonition, the great second chapter of Philippians, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves." Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interest of others. And then he goes on from there to describe the mind or the attitude that Jesus had in verses 5 to 11 of giving up for a time his heavenly position in order to be a servant and a helper for us. Then he says here, he quotes Proverbs chapter 3, verse 34, when he says, "God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." Now, this word for opposes means that God sets himself against the proud. It's like God draws up an army and gets it ready for battle in his opposition to pride. So you don't want to thank God for the humility you think you have, because he opposes the proud. And he really doesn't like the proud. See, I just softened that. Actually, he hates the sin of pride. Remember Proverbs 6, there are 6 things the Lord hates and 7 that are detestable to him. And the first one on the list is haughty eyes, pride. And then in Proverbs 8, verse 13, he says, "To fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate pride and arrogance, evil behavior and perverse speech." And evil behavior and perverse speech will flow out of pride, that we think we're pretty hot stuff, pretty important. But the Lord has ways of figuring out how to put us in positions where we find out we're not as good as we thought we were. Isaiah chapter 2 is a really strong passage about this. The prophet says, "The eyes of the arrogant man will be humbled, and the pride of men brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day. The Lord Almighty has a day in store for all the proud and lofty." Ouch. "For all that is exalted, and they will be humbled," he says. "The arrogance of man will be brought low, and the pride of men humbled. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day." The Lord does not like to share his glory with the proud, with the arrogant. He will share it with those of us who come humbly, but he won't share it otherwise. The story is told of Muhammad Ali, that one day he was flying on the plane to one of his places he wanted to go, and nobody ever thought that Muhammad Ali was a humble person, because he went around saying, "I am the greatest. You hear that, Joe Frazier? I am the greatest." So he flies on this airplane, and during the flight, a little bit of an emergency came up, just some foul weather, and there was a little bit of turbulence, and the plane was starting to toss about, and the stewardess came up and said to the whole group, "You need to fasten your seatbelts immediately." So everybody complied except for Muhammad Ali, and she confronted him about that. The flight attendant did, and she said, "Will you please observe the order of fastening your seatbelt. And he said, Superman don't need no seatbelt. And she said, Superman don't need no airplane either. Yeah, that's that's what it is. That's the way it goes. He's that way. Then there's the story of the Amish farmer. This is how deceitful pride can be. Who bought a new pair of overalls, and he was trying to avoid the sin of pride. So he put these overalls on. He looked in the mirror and he said, "Oh, this will never do. I'll be proud in these." So he removed his new overalls. He put on the patched ones that he wanted to replace. And he stood again in front of the mirror and he says, "You'd look good in anything." That's how pride is. The great Bible teacher and one of the pastors of the Moody Church in Chicago, H.A. Ironside, he was concerned about pride being a problem in his life, and so he asked a friend, "What advice do you have for me?" And the friend said, "Well, why don't you take yourself and put yourself in one of those sandwich signboards and go out and basically be humbled as you share the gospel on the streets of Chicago." So Ironside went out and did that. And as he was taking it off at the end of the time, he said to himself, "I'll bet you I'm the only person that would do something like this." Again, the exercise to rid himself of pride instead fostered pride happening. F.B. Meyer has written that the only hope of a decreasing self is an increasing Christ. Remember, John the Baptizer said, "He must increase, I must decrease." And that's what the Lord is up to in us all the way through our Christian lives, is to put us in that position where in order to experience more of Jesus, we have to put ourselves more and more on the shelf. And we're supposed to be a disciple of Christ, to learn from him. And he described himself as humble and gentle and meek and lowly of heart. And that's how we need to be as well. But we can't do it on our own, in our own way, in our own strength. We got to have some outside help. And that's what point 3 is about.